It is great to welcome Professor Thomas F. Powers of Carthage College back to the podcast. The last time we conversed was a year ago. We were discussing his book, American Multiculturalism and the Anti-Discrimination Regime. And he has recently come out with a rather lengthy article being published by the very credible website Quillette. It is titled Trump and the DEI Counter-Revolution. Welcome back, Tom, to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm great. Yeah, I really appreciate being here again.
Yeah, and we appreciate having you on. So I had a read through the entire thing. I find it very interesting. So clearly we are living in shifting times, would you say?
Yeah, I'll say. Wow, absolutely. A lot of changes. I was surprised, I have to say. I learned some things about myself even from Donald Trump. I'm indebted to Donald Trump in ways I did not realize because he has done things I didn't think were possible and
Hmm.
so fast. And so once they were done, it was obvious they were possible. And in a way, I should have seen them. I've been studying civil rights politics for so long that uh, I should have seen. In a way, his strategy was bold, but visible for anybody who understood the law. I mean, that's why I think his changes will be lasting because his approach works within the existing framework of the law in such a way that it'd be very hard to. I mean, it could be undone, but it would take amazing political will for Democrats to come back and try to restore everything he is eliminating overnight.
Oh yeah.
So
So
big
tell me,
changes.
what did he do?
Okay, well, he maybe I'll begin with the three things that were most sort of striking that I mentioned at the beginning of the essay, and then we can go into more detail. But the first three things that just knocked me on my butt were he revoked Executive Order 11246, which was put in place in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson. And people were calling for that before the election. People like Richard Hanania, for instance. Well, no, you know what? Hanania didn't even. Hanania's out there. He's as radical as anybody pushing for change, but he didn't even. No, that's not right. I looked because I actually looked at his book to see, and even Hanania did not call for revoking 11246, as I recall. He talks about changing it, like editing it, or modifying it, making it weaker or something like that. But even Hanania. So anyway, that was a big one because it shut down the federal contracting dimension of affirmative action programs, and so we can talk more about affirmative action as one side of things. But so that was really bold. Ronald Reagan came very close. His Attorney General Edward Meese actually kind of authored or put together this big volume that I have in my basement, about the problems with affirmative action, with Executive Order 11426 and what's called or 11246, what's called disparate impact and so on. And they were chomping at the bit to do this, but for a variety of political reasons, Reagan he just couldn't pull the trigger. And so that was one that was really big. Another was just all at once getting rid of all the DEI officers and officers. And and we'll come back to this, but that's just genius. I mean, just get rid of the people in the offices who do stuff. And that's complicated in a way, but it's also just brilliant because it shuts everything down immediately. And I didn't think of that. Like I just never thought, yeah, just do that. Because as far as I know, I don't think any red state has done that either, right? A lot of stuff has been going on in 20 plus red states in the last 4 years where they're getting pretty aggressive against DEI. But to my knowledge, no state just did that. Like all of a sudden, just get rid of every single office and officer and program that is connected to DEI all at once. Just go after them. And yeah, we'll need to talk more about what that means and why that was possible and so on, because, well, it's complicated. And in a way, somebody like me who's enmeshed in civil rights law, thinking about civil rights law and politics and how it has become so powerful, I thought that the law was more powerful than it was, and his strategy allows you to sidestep all of that at once. And that's genius if that's what you want to do. So
Mhm.
those are the two things that I would mention. Plus, and this is outside, I don't really talk about this in my article much, but he also fired two Democratic members of the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that may be that could be challenged in the courts. It could there are other independent regulatory commissions, they're called, in the United States, where these bodies have a kind of insulation from presidential control by design. This goes back to the progressive era when people actually had faith that some of these institutions would be better off if they're insulated from political control and run by experts. Now, the EEOC and the Civil Rights Commission have never been apolitical. They've always been very political and almost always far left. In fact, controlled, captive, agencies of the civil rights left. And so, by firing two of the four existing members, it's a 5-person commission, and there's one vacancy that nobody could fill because a Republican would have needed to go in there, and so Biden didn't want to put anybody in or whatever. I don't actually know the history there, but there were only four, so he eliminated two, leaving one Republican and one Democrat. He named the remaining Republican the chair of the EEOC, and they don't have a quorum. They have to have a majority of 3 to actually conduct business. So right now, the EEOC is just dead in the water. It cannot act. So this may be, a violation of the way Congress set it up, you could say, in the future, and there may be lawsuits about it. I think other independent regulatory commissions are going to be the ones that, like Consumer Finance Protection Board or National Labor Relations Board. Those will be the ones that the lawsuits may focus on. But even if they lose in court, for a year at least, it's going to be shut down. The EEOC is just not going to be functioning. And what happened in 2016 when Trump became president is the EEOC became a kind of institutional bulwark that could fight back against the kind of conservative position on civil rights very effectively. Because the EEOC is an incredibly powerful institution because, thousands and thousands of lawsuits come through there all the time, anti-discrimination lawsuits, Title VII. That's their job, is to enforce Title VII. And so they have all these administrative law judges. They are developing and interpreting the law constantly. So shutting that down while he is cleaning house, that was actually really important, practically. And shocking to me. Like, I just thought, I didn't even see that coming. And so in these different ways, those are just 3 examples. I mean, they're big examples of broad strokes that Trump is moving forward with. I mean, that's just the 3 big ones. And we could talk about my articles organized around 2 faces of civil rights politics that are sort of illuminated by what Trump has done. Do you want me to maybe say something about that? Or
Yeah,
did you
you're
have
welcome to. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So my paper, and Quillette was very kind to be willing to publish such a long piece. And I actually pitched it to them because they also run series of essays. And so I thought, well, I'll pitch them 3 essays all at once. And they decided to, just because it's so topical, at the moment, they decided to run it all at once. And I was very happy with that. And I'm very happy people reading it, and people are reading it. I guess I get every once in a while I get an email from somebody, which is nice to see. But my article is organized in 3 parts. The first 2 parts deal with what Trump is doing, and so I set up a kind of outline of the legal structure of civil rights politics and civil rights law in part 1, before turning to what Trump has done to affect it. And then in part 3, I'm sort of giving some advice to the Trump administration about how they need to do more, I think, to turn their program into a broader civil rights reform agenda for the future. Because if they do that, that will be extremely helpful to the country and to the Republican Party, to be honest. I mean, to them politically, I think it will help them too. So that's the structure of my article. And so in the first part, I make this case for looking at civil rights politics as having sort of two bundles that are interconnected, but also quite different. And if you want to start from DEI or wokeness, those are terms we use, we throw around, and they're sort of vague. They're ambiguous. What does DEI mean? What does wokeness mean? I think they mean basically the left interpretation of civil rights politics. But other people would disagree with me and say, no, wokeness is a kind of new religion, or wokeness is the product of various left-leaning ideas that come from outside the United States. And that's a very interesting fact that we don't really know. I think anybody who says they have the final interpretation of DEI or wokeness is up against it, because there's so many competing interpretations. That's actually something I'm going to be writing about soon, I hope. And I think it's a fascinating fact. We're sort of, you think about like the French Revolution. Even today, people look back at the French Revolution. They have competing theories of what it was, why it happened, what it means. And I think we're in the middle of something like that with whatever wokeness or DEI is. But to the extent that Trump helps illuminate what has happened, and I do think he does because of his actions, trying to summarize everything that he does, I put everything into two bundles. And I'm on team politics or team law. Like my point of view, I emphasize the civil rights politics, the civil rights regime, or whatever you want to call it. And the subtitle of my book you were kind enough to mention, the anti-discrimination regime, right? That's my sort of take. But that is what I kind of focus on in this article too. And I leave it to others to fill in, the other aspects of it. But there are these two phases of anti-discrimination. One has to do with group equality, or group inequality, remedying group inequality. And if you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI is very clear that you're not allowed to have quotas or, group representation for all the different races or something like that. That is not the idea. It's colorblind equality. It's non-discrimination. Do not discriminate on the basis of race. So that would include what came to be called reverse discrimination, affirmative action and policies that were designed to remedy manifest group inequalities in the country between races, or later, between gender, between men and women. Those are the two big ones where affirmative action really played a role. And not so much, disability or age discrimination, or even LGBTQ. Nobody really wants to do affirmative action for those groups, which is, I don't know why. It's an interesting fact. But anyway, so group equality is one side of this project, and that emerged immediately after the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Hubert Humphrey was going around reassuring all Republicans that, oh, no, we're not going to get into quotas. It's not going to be affirmative action. What today we call affirmative action. It's not going to be group representation. We don't want that. But that's immediately what happened. And Executive Order 11246 actually put that in place in 1965. You could say, a year later. And then others, Richard Nixon, to be sure, it wasn't just Democrats, helped to make that a reality. Chief Justice Berger wrote famous Griggs decision in 1971, I think it was. And so another conservative Supreme Court justice there helped create what's called disparate impact. So I talk about these different group equality projects under 6 bundles, and I'll come back to that in a second. But then there's a second side of things. So it's not just group equality. It's also, today, what I think we hate most of all is the cultural side, what I call in the article, the cultural side of civil rights politics. The moralizing, the preachiness, the censorship, people getting fired, cancel culture, people being in your business, having somebody down the hallway who is your coworker, but also kind of snooping around, like, are you a racist? Are you sexist? This sort of thing, right? And so the privatized enforcement of a civil rights law and that cultural dimension, I think that's actually the main thing that is hated today. When people talk about woke, that's really what they mean. But in going after both of these things simultaneously, the Trump administration shows both that they're there and that they're interconnected, I think. And that's quite useful. And no one is complaining, by the way. You could say, well, technically speaking, wokeness is just those cultural efforts. Um, and so Trump should not have gone after affirmative action. No one is saying that, right? No one is complaining about that. Everybody sees that these things are somehow connected. And what I would say about both of them is that they both go beyond the text of the 19th and the intent, the spirit of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Nowhere in the 1964 Civil Rights Act will you find anything about group equality, and nowhere will you find a program of cultural indoctrination, mind shaping and penalizing people in a severe way for things like harassment, offensive statements. I mean, that's just nowhere in the text of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But all of that came out of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and developed in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and was well established by the end of the 1990s. So those are the two faces of the civil rights regime and Trump helps us see that because he attacks both by going after affirmative action, 11246, and other actions I can talk about that his administration has taken. He really hit hard against affirmative action and disparate impact and related group equality policies. And by eliminating all of the DEI offices and officers and programs in one shot, he eliminated the basis within the federal government anyway of the censorship, cancel culture, diversity training, all of that kind of stuff just went away immediately. And so that side, the cultural program of civil rights law also, at least within the federal government, disappeared. And there are efforts on both sides of this, the affirmative action side, the group equality side on one hand, and on the other hand, the cultural side. The Trump administration is showing too that they're going to reach into the private sector with this too, into private businesses, into higher education, public and private. And so this is going to be it's already a broader and fairly pervasive campaign. So those are the two sides. And the way my article goes is to lay that out at the beginning and then to just go through each. So if you want, I can just talk. Do you have a preference? You want me to talk about the cultural side or the group equality side first?
Well,
Or do you have any questions, before I just go on and on?
okay. So, with that preface, I like to ask this. So, at the end of the article, you suggest that there should be a 1964 originalism being put in place as a baseline, so to speak, for future civil rights reform. So,
Yeah.
I suppose unlike the Constitution, we know with more clarity what the original intent of the framers of the 1964 Civil Rights Act were. So,
Yeah,
were they?
and it hasn't been studied. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what was the original intent of the 1964 Act? What was the things that the framers hoped to prevent, and what were their future, I guess, applications of it, like intended to be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So 1964 originalism, which is, by the way, the term is Richard Hanania's, and in my book came out right around, actually just a little bit before Hanania's book, and I was in effect calling for that, but I didn't use the term. I really wish I had, but anyway, it's a great term and very important. I think moving forward, we need to embrace that idea. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, what its intent was, that will be a matter of historical debate now as going forward. There are debates about the meaning of the American founding, the original intent of the American founding, the original intent of the Civil War amendments, the 14th and 15th and 13th amendments. That's a huge scholarly debate. And there will be something like that for the 1964 Civil Rights Act too, going forward, and the other civil rights laws of the 1960s. So I'm sure there'll be tons of debate there. But one starting point I would point to would just be the text. If you look at the text of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, people were nervous. Barry Goldwater, for instance, and he did prove to be right, but there's no way he knew enough to know why this was right. He thought that going into the private sector in Title II and Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he thought that was the police state, right? This is going to be trouble. He was right. I mean, it turns out he really was right. I don't know if it was a police state exactly, but it was something that nobody knew how to handle. It was like a force of nature that once it was launched. But if you look at today, the actual substance of Title II and Title VII in the text, as it was originally written, was something I think everybody would think would be fine. If we could just have that, right wingers and left wingers would all accept that. The left would obviously want more. But so Title II just says, well, no discrimination in restaurants and theaters and golf courses and gas stations. I mean, the cafeterias. I mean, there's a long list in the text of the bill. Actually, it's amazing how many actual specific things they list. But what we call our social spaces. The term is usually used public accommodations, but they don't mean governmental. They mean private sector. So this is private life, social life, and signs that said no blacks allowed or whatever. They went away immediately, basically. And that was that. I mean, there were a few lawsuits. I think the last one was in 1969. I know of three lawsuits, I think, where there were challenges, constitutional challenges to Title II. Supreme Court upheld Title II in every instance. And so, there was like for 4 or 5 years, a little bit of resistance in the South, but basically that was it. And then, today, no one is calling for, to my knowledge, racial segregation in public spaces and, drinking fountains for different races. I mean, no one. We are beyond that. So you could say, I think Barry Goldwater even would say, yeah. Well, that's fine. We don't want to bring that back. And so Title II by itself is fine. Title VII is where things get very tricky because the text of Title VII, all it says, basically, is, if you hire or fire or fail to promote or fail to give a pay increase to somebody because of their race, that's what we call under the law disparate treatment, where there's intentional, deliberate racism in employment decisions. And there was segregated employment. I mean, professions, medical profession, lawyers, today they're all progressive and woke. But guess what? Back in the 1950s and 60s, they segregated and they excluded blacks from their professions. The National Education Association was the all-white, educational professional organization. There was a rival for the teachers of black students that allowed blacks and whites both. But anyway, so, segregation was throughout the professional world and the world of employment, and that got shut down too. And today, again, no one is calling for, we need to let employers have a racist employment policy. No blacks allowed. If you're hired, don't apply for this job. I think no one would call for that. But Title VII, unlike Title II, exploded. So you get, and so I'll talk about that. But 1964 originalism, I think if you go back to the idea of no segregation and no overt, deliberate, intentional discrimination in hiring and firing and the like, in those kinds of decisions, I think that would be universal. There would be a few people who would oppose, but they don't count. No one who would oppose that would ever get elected dog catcher anywhere in the United States today. And so it's a solid place to start from. And, I guess I always thought, well, maybe Title II and Title VII, there was just something kind of problematic about the idea of going into the private sector. When I wrote my dissertation in 1999, I guess it was kind of like, wow, something happened when we went into that. Maybe Barry Goldwater was right, But I think in hindsight, I can see more clearly now that it really was legal changes that came in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that exploded out the original meaning of the 1964 Act. And you could say, well, maybe there was something about stepping into the private sector in the way that the civil rights laws did that opened the door to that, and that might be true. And so reining things back in to 1964 originalism would be very hard, especially because I think no one is going to ever call now for getting rid of the idea of sexual harassment, for instance. And that was not part of the original package. That did not appear, or that did not get sort of established until 1986 in a Supreme Court decision. And that built from there. So we're never going to go back, it seems to me, to pure 1964 originalism, but it is a good place to start and to see the wisdom of what was in that original starting point, and to start thinking critically about what came later, and to start making distinctions. We have to, I think, one big point in my essay, and I wish I could have, maybe made it in the first sentence, is the spell has broken. The spell of civil rights moralism is now really, in a way, it's like the king. The children's story. The king has no clothes, right?
Yeah.
And something like that is, I think, now gonna become part of our broader popular understanding of civil rights. That we're not going to be treating this as if it's simply sacred. You're not allowed to criticize the civil rights revolution. I don't think you should criticize groups, right? Myself, I don't think you should just be like criticize women or criticize gays or criticize blacks. I think that would be a problem. But to criticize civil rights law and civil rights politics, I think that is going to start to happen more, and people are going to start to understand that something kind of went haywire. So that's, in broad strokes, the argument for 1964 originalism is that it helps us identify things that happened in the 60s that were necessary, that we would say today are still necessary, that went beyond the like Brown versus Board of Education was not enough. That was public sector only. So something more had to change. But it also allows us to start making distinctions between what was core and essential in the 1960s and then what happened later. Because what happened later, no one predicted that, and that's an amazing fact. Nobody was predicting in 1964 anything like what happened. Wokeness, DEI, all the stuff that's going on, that people get kind of intersectionality, all these crazy ideas, all of that. Nobody would have predicted that. That would have sounded like science fiction. Even Barry Goldwater, when he raised the alarm about this in the 1964 election against Lyndon Johnson, even the things he says didn't go that far. Yeah, that's 64 originalism in a nutshell.
Okay. So,
do you want me to talk more about the two sides of things and how Trump's taking them down? I mean, I don't need to go on and on about it, but that does take up the bulk of my essay.
yeah,
or do you have something else you'd rather ask? I'm easy either way.
Yeah, we can lead up to that. But one thing that, or at least two things I've discovered, in your legal history, is that following the passing of the Civil Rights Act, there were decades of basically people calling for group-based rights. There were, of course, women's rights, and there were gay rights, and now we're facing trans rights. And for the most part, I think that has contributed to the environment of the legal regime we know now as DEI.
Yeah, that's true. I tend not to. I tend to focus on in a way, the mechanics of anti-discrimination enforcement, and not as much the actual groups and how they were empowered. But that's a massively important dimension of it, because if you think about the coalition, and this is one reason that I, as somebody studied this, one of the arguments I gave for why this was going to continue to shape the civil rights revolution as it had been taken over by the left. One reason I thought it could not be pushed back, and I was wrong, Trump has proven me wrong, but one reason I thought it could not be pushed back against was because if you add together the coalition of different groups, that it's very quickly the overwhelming population of America. So, you start with blacks and other ethnic minorities, Latinos above all, but also Asians and Native Americans are certainly covered under anti-discrimination. And that's a significant chunk of the population, still a minority. But then you add women, and immediately you got a very large coalition. And then other smaller groups, religious minorities would be affected there, and LGBT folks, the disabled, the elderly, right? So you start pretty soon, if you live long enough, every American is covered by anti-discrimination law. And so one thing that's always struck me is how popular anti-discrimination law is to Congress, because at any turn, they're happy to pass another law. Like in the middle of, I can't remember the timing now, but it was, I think, around 2020 and after, and there was a lot of complaining about wokeness and so on the right. But then something happened with, I'm just going to bollocks the details, but there was this sort of anti-Asian discrimination going on. So Congress just all of a sudden just passed another anti-Asian discrimination bill in there somewhere, and it just struck me, yeah, this is always popular because I think members of Congress are always sensing, well, this is going to be popular with voters because civil rights appeals to so many people, and so that is a dimension of it. But then the question is, well, then how did wokeness become so unpopular? And how did it become, in a way, a popular majority? Now, you can't say that Trump was elected only because of anti-DEI, but so that is an interesting question and a complicated one. And my sense of it is that the vagueness of DEI and the ambiguity of DEI and wokeness as terms is actually really, really important, because if people were attacking left anti-discrimination or the left interpretation of civil rights, I think it would be less popular. But everybody knows what wokeness is, and it's these aspects of politics that run up against our liberal democratic heritage, about legislating morality and free speech and separation of public and private and so on. And so that chafes. And then also, of course, majority groups with the law. That's a term of law, actually, majority group. And it's not always accurate, but because males are not technically a majority of the American population, but males, whites, Christians, and straights, they in a way also kind of are the groups that get pointed out as having in the past been the agents of discrimination. And so in something like the 1619 Project, that starts with American racism and nothing but American racism, and in a way wants to reduce all of American history to America's racist past and so on. Those groups are also kind of pushing back now. So it's a combination of our liberal democratic tradition and those groups, and then how does that connect with the groups that are connected to anti-discrimination? And then the role of women, I think, is a crucial one always. How are women feeling about all this? Because they, if they go with anti-discrimination, well, it's a lock. And Judas, and I'm going to bollocks the guy's name, but Teixeira, I apologize if I've mispronounced
Judas and Teixeira, yeah, they're
Teixeira. Okay, yeah, their book,
yeah,
you're familiar with it, right? So they wrote a book a long time ago now about the emerging Democratic majority. They thought this was, in a way, they were in effect calling for an anti-discrimination majority coalition, and now they're on the opposite. They're saying that was a mistake. We were wrong. They're very honest scholars. I'm impressed by their turnabout. They're saying, no, this was a disaster for the Democratic Party. It has failed, and it's now killing us because we've bought into these very unpopular ideas. So sorting all that out, you need somebody who really Kaufman, he's got all the numbers. His work on this is great. Somebody like that who can dig into all the opinion polls and voting records and all that. And that's not my bailiwick, but I just focus mostly on the law and the ideas. And but you're right. That's a really, really important dimension of the change. And you know what? It's also a sign that things could go back the other way to some degree, right? Because if you go back just to 2000, I mean, in my opinion, the woke upsurge or the DEI upsurge or what people call the Great Awakening or whatever, that happened around 2015. Well, there were two gay marriage decisions in 2013 and 2015. And then the Me Too movement launched around 2017. And then you get Black Lives Matter, a couple of years later. And so that was really powerful. And it was on the other side. So Donald Trump, you could say a lot of people try to reduce this wokeness stuff to that period. I think that's a mistake because I think the conditions for all of it were laid. The foundations for all of it were laid in decades before, and you have to understand that. But don't forget that just 5 years ago or 6 years ago, this stuff we were at peak woke, right? And so it's this stuff is powerful. That's one thing that I am just struck by too, is like there's something like the force of history in this. It's just like this wave that no one could have foreseen or predicted, and I think we still don't fully understand it. It is sort of like the French Revolution or something like that. Like just all of a sudden, boom, and everything changes, and then you clean up the mess afterwards. Everybody's trying to figure out what it all meant and what's left from it and that sort of thing. So yeah, but that's what I would say about the groups. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. I suppose the quote was attributed to Lenin, but he said there are decades where nothing happens, but there are weeks or years where decades happen.
Well, that's a great
Yeah.
line. I guess I've never heard that, I have to admit.
So,
But yeah, oh, that's true. Well, right. And I think we're living through something like that right now with Trump, because he is resetting the agenda of civil rights politics. Now, it would help if they would start using that language and start saying that that's what they're doing, and not just leaving it at DEI and woke, because those terms are ambiguous. No one really knows what they mean, especially wokeness. No one knows what that means. And DEI is connected to civil rights politics. You could kind of make a legalistic argument, like especially the word diversity goes back to the 1970s Bakke affirmative action decision, and equity. The meaning of equity is connected to disparate impact and so on. You could kind of make a legalistic or political, like civil rights politics based claim for that term, but that's not what most people think. And people don't even use the full term. They just say DEI. And then what do we mean, right? It's an acronym. So, but do you want me to say something about affirmative action and then the cultural programs and how the Trump administration's efforts have taken those down, I think, in a significant way, or is that?
sure. I'd like to know first, I
Sure.
think what Trump is doing is what conservatives for decades have failed to do. And I wonder why yeah, conservatives have,
Oh,
for
I
the
love
most
that
part,
question. That's
gone
an
along
excellent
with
question.
this.
The answer, in my opinion, and this is one place I do disagree with Hanania, because he has a good chapter on the presidents, Republican presidents, and the Republican Party stance. And he has, I forget what his explanation is, but he just doesn't say the obvious thing, which is all these presidents, they believed in the morality, the moral rightness of civil rights. It was also partly political calculation, like in the case of Nixon. Everybody points out that affirmative action, that he had this Southern strategy and so on. But I do think that Richard Nixon he was on Eisenhower's. He was sort of Eisenhower's point man on civil rights, and I assume he was sincerely supportive of civil rights. My parents were civil rights activists. They were white Midwesterners from North Dakota and Indiana, and they went to college in the North, But when the '60s came along, they moved south. My dad managed hotels in the South. He had an MBA, and he went into the hotel business, and he integrated those hotels. And then they ended up in Atlanta, and he took that job because of the Civil Rights Revolution. He ended up leaving that job and working for Morris Brown College, a historically Black college or university, HBCU, they call them in the U.S., and started a restaurant management program there. And growing up, for me, that was like having a dad who had been and a mom who had been a veteran of World War II, and you'd sit around and there were stories they told about threatening phone calls, run-ins with weird people out in North Georgia. Really, like it was a whole thing. And so for me, it's just obvious. The morality of the civil rights revolution is really powerful. It still is. And, the Trump administration very wisely is appealing to that. They over and over again are appealing to the authority of civil rights law in affirming what they're doing. No one is criticizing that. And I think that's because the moral power, racism was awful, right? and the treatment of American blacks was awful. And that is a horrible legacy or a horrible period of our history that we are rightly proud of the American effort to get over that, to get through that somehow, to get beyond that. Martin Luther King is an American hero for a reason, and but there are problems that have come out of the Civil Rights Revolution too, and that's, I think, where we're finally getting to. And one piece of evidence, Hanania does a good job surveying the presidents and their stances on civil rights, and it's interesting to see, especially Nixon, was a big supporter of civil rights, and but I have a footnote in my book about all the Supreme Court justices because I was struck by this over and over again. The most important of all the what I would call the architecture of wokeness that comes out of developments after 1964 is probably Meritor Savings Bank versus Vincent, a 1986 Supreme Court decision affirming that the idea of harassment is discrimination under Title VII. And you know who wrote that opinion? And it embodies the principles of a radical feminist law professor named Catherine McKinnon. And the guy who wrote that opinion is Rehnquist, Chief Justice William Rehnquist. I mean, a very conservative member of the court during those years. And then Sandra Day O'Connor, sort of center right Supreme Court justice. She's responsible for a number of decisions. Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, he wrote a whole bunch, of course, gay rights cases. He wanted to go down in history as advocating for LGBT folks, and he will. But he also wrote one of the two opinions in the Eller-Farragut test that I think is really important. Justice Scalia, he extended harassment law to LGBT folks. Like that, the question is, can harassment include a gay man harassing another man in the workplace? And Scalia was the one who said yes. And then that set the stage for the Bostock decision written by Justice Gorsuch, which is in a way a very radical extension of employment discrimination protections to LGBT folks, at least in the workplace. And then, the Biden administration tried to say that extended into the educational domain as well. And Chief Justice Berger wrote the Griggs decision, the disparate impact case that everybody looks back to. And I'm probably forgetting a couple other justices in there who helped build the architecture of not just civil rights politics, but the left interpretation of civil rights politics. Over and over again, it was conservatives who didn't just vote yes, they wrote the opinions. And the reason that happened is the morality of the civil rights revolution. They thought it was right. That's it, I think, ultimately. There's a simple answer to your question. But it's an excellent question. Like, yeah, how did this happen? It happened with the help of both parties. And now what Trump, I think, has identified is a real opportunity for Republicans if they can come up with a powerful statement of the change that's happening now. And if it's a very important moment, because if they get that wrong, it could just be like, well, we're gonna do to the left what you guys did to us in the past. We're gonna help, we're gonna turn this into I don't think anybody's gonna turn it into affirmative action for whites, but we're gonna go after wokeness. We're gonna use the tools of wokeness to go after stuff we don't like or something like that. It could look just like well, some people use the term woke right. I don't like that term. Some of the people who use it, I guess I don't agree with them. So I'd rather not use that term myself, but there is a danger that that's what this moment could be reduced to, instead of becoming the starting point of broad civil rights reform. And that's a winning position for Republicans. If they can articulate that well, I think that could be maybe the foundation for a kind of political realignment of the political parties. I gave a talk a while at Missouri State University about this, and that was before the election. So I was trying to, in my mind, just imagine what that would look like. But now I think it's a real possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we certainly look forward to what the future holds.
What's that?
We certainly look forward to what the future holds.
Yeah, it could be quite useful. I do think there's some work to be done. To articulate, 1964 originalism, colorblind equality and the ties to our liberal democratic constitutional order as three planks. I'm sure there would be other ideas that would be very valuable as well. Three planks of a kind of broad civil rights reform agenda. And I can say more about the other two. I talked about 1964 originalism. I could talk more about why, liberalism, the role of the liberal constitutional tradition, or what colorblind constitutionalism means, or colorblind equality, if you want, but I don't. Should I do that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's
Okay. All right. I just briefly. This is my three plank platform. So I might as well just lay out the other two planks briefly. Colorblind constitutionalism has a kind of legalistic meaning, and that's somewhat unfortunate. That's why I think the Trump administration needs to spell it out on its own terms, because to some degree they are deferring to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court's doctrine of colorblind constitutionalism has two sides. One is just the moral argument for colorblind non-discrimination, which is solid and important. But the other side is this legalistic thing called levels of scrutiny. There's something called strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and the rational basis test. And race gets strict scrutiny, and then you get a two-pronged test, compelling governmental interest plus narrowly tailored. And nobody wants to hear about that. Nobody, unless you're taking a constitutional law class, and you have to, you don't want to learn about that stuff. So it needs to be stated as a moral principle. And then there are authors like Andrew Cull and Peter Myers have written very good books on this that I provide links to in my article. There are already people articulated the argument. It goes back to the Civil War and to the idea of equal treatment under the law, equal citizenship, and equal opportunity. That's a powerful moral package that we need to come back to, not group equality, not trying to make everybody think the same or something like that through indoctrination. It's a somewhat less ambitious ideal of anti-discrimination, maybe, but it's solid. And that's our tradition, is to try to maybe lower somewhat the aim, but then it's achievable, unlike what we're doing now, which is some kind of idea of anti-racism in which everybody's always wrong no matter what you do, and this sort of thing, and we're all just afraid and criticizing one another and hypersensitive and so on. I mean, that is proven. I think the popular opinion has shown, no, we don't want that anymore. And so colorblind equality, some notion of equal citizenship, equality before the law, and equal opportunity is available to us. It's been articulated, by very smart people like Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass and a million other, 1,000 other scholars and politicians in the years since. And it's a powerful and noble tradition that we should go back to. Our liberal democratic constitutional tradition is in a way associated with that, but it's useful to distinguish a little bit, because the other things we learn from our liberal constitutional tradition include things like free speech is important, so if we see censorship, that's a problem. The separation of public-private, to the extent that can be honored, we should honor it. So reaching into people's private brains and telling them how to think about gender and sex and what, pronouns or whatever, all that stuff, that the popular will has recognized that's going too far. We get very nervous when people are trying to change the way we think as a solution to a political problem. And it hasn't worked, I think you could also say. Now, the answer from some people on the left would be, yes, you need to do more. And that's when we hear that, we're like, come on. Also, due process. Think about Title IX proceedings, right, on college campuses. There's been a lot about that. The Department of Education back and forth over the rules there. We want somehow protections for people when they're being accused of serious matters. And I would say that maybe ought to be extended into the workplace too, and not only in sexual harassment cases, but in other instances where people are being fired by some HR person. The way that happens is something that people's rights are probably being violated there as well. And that's a complicated one, because people on the right don't really want workers to have new rights, even if they're due process rights. But so due process, freedom of speech, separation of public private, the idea that legislating morality is a problem. That's also part of our liberal tradition. The idea that factions or groups are dangerous. I go back to Federalist 10. We're kind of nervous about factions. Do we really want to ramp them up and get them all excited and worried and anxious and paranoid about one another? No, no. So any politics that does that, that's also part of our liberal tradition, especially if you go back to the American liberal democratic teaching about religion, the separation of church and state, the idea of toleration. Again, a somewhat lower standard than ideas of respect, but achievable and workable. And taking seriously the idea that groups should get along peacefully. That's an important thing. We want groups to tolerate one another so that they're not, in strife with one another, and some kind of civic harmony on that basis. So there are a lot of ideas and practices from our liberal democratic constitutional tradition that are worth thinking about as well, and that we could benefit from. So that's my three planks of my civil rights reform platform moving forward, and I think that's a pretty powerful combination. A lot of things that we could rely on, and that if you present that, the American people will see, yes, this is sensible. And I think also the American people are ready now to start saying, well, maybe the civil rights revolution, we went off the rails a little bit there. We got too idealistic, and idealism can lead to problems. And we do have experience with that through the Cold War. We know Marxism, a lot of young students teaching Marxism in class, you always kind of get this idea, well, Marxism is a good idea, but it just didn't go well, And so I don't know if that's ultimately accurate or adequate, but people have that sense about Marxism. And I think we could start to teach ourselves that that's probably the way we need to think about civil rights idealism too. It was a noble ideal. There are aspects of it that are absolutely essential moving forward, but something just went haywire, and moral idealism is dangerous. And that's something that our liberal democratic constitutional tradition teaches us.
Yeah, and it's pretty apt that you mentioned, Marxism, because on this day, 21st of February, 1848, the Communist Manifesto was first published.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a fitting connection to make. Absolutely.
And of course, since I think we mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. A few days ago was MLK Day. Americans celebrated, as they should. But of course, there's always the question of what did Martin Luther King Jr. really teach? And you have a lot of disputes between left-wingers and right-wingers on this subject. Now, I'm not going to ask this question, but I am going to ask is, what American tradition, political or social or culture, does Martin Luther King Jr. belong to?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my book, I focused on a guy James A. Banks, who is the leading authority on multicultural education, a Black educator who came out of the Civil Rights Revolution and then was the voice of the Civil Rights Revolution within the world of teacher education for, his entire career. Was the most important guy on multicultural education. And in my opinion, he is more valuable to us to read because he is trying to articulate the vision of the Civil Rights Revolution. He's more important than Martin Luther King in that respect. I'm not saying he's more politically important, but as a voice. And, I have looked at Martin Luther King. I thought, in my dissertation, maybe I'd have a chapter, but it got bogged down. There are things he says that reflect the liberal democratic tradition. For instance, he says, well, nobody wants legislating morality. There's one quotation I have in my book, where he says this, and you're like, Martin Luther King says that? I mean, and then would he be for affirmative action? Well, eventually, yes. But there are other things he says that don't suggest that or that point the other way. And there's an awful lot of his thought that is bound up with other things, like anti-war protest, and the war in Vietnam was very important, and nonviolent protests, and Gandhi and so on. And so it is I'm sure that if you studied all Martin Luther King to understand his vision of civil rights politics, it would be valuable. But it just seemed to me it was too complicated. And also, he didn't live into the civil rights revolution long enough to get into the mindset of it in the way that somebody like James A. Banks, who, I don't know, he probably retired more than 10 years ago now. He's a emeritus professor, but he was writing throughout the development of the civil rights revolution, and even in the 1970s, he was articulating stuff that today we would call wokeness, right? These pretty radical interpretations of civil rights law, and so I just always found it very valuable. In a way that Martin Luther King, I don't know, you're just into 100 different debates and extraneous questions. And so, yeah, I hate to have to say it. I just don't think he's the voice of the civil rights revolution in the way. So I don't know what tradition. He comes from a number of different traditions, to answer your question. And I would say his was a mind in transition. He came out of the liberal tradition. He was shaped by it to some degree, but then things were changing. And he died young, and of course tragically, and too early to, in a way, to have worked out, I assume, a broad vision of the future of things. I assume he would have gone in the direction of somebody like James A. Banks in this left direction, given the trajectory of his politics in the 1960s. After the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he moved pretty hard left on the war and some other things, and so the war and poverty and so on. So I assume he would move left on civil rights politics as well, but that would be speculation. So,
Yeah. Yeah, the way I see it, there are similarities between how we interpret the speeches and writings of Martin Luther King Jr. versus how I think Christians interpret the letters of St. Paul. Like there are quotations and verses of Paul that may appeal to Catholics, but there are those that appeal to Protestants and even those that appeal
yeah,
to neither. So the debates just go on and on. It depends on the context in which the letter of
yeah,
Paul or the speeches of MLK was written or spoken, and what they were intending, the message they were intending to broadcast at that time.
yeah. I mean, you're raising a very important question, actually, of like, what is the voice of the civil rights revolution? Where do you find it? And it's an interesting fact that there is no John Locke or John Rawls of the civil rights revolution. Even today, there isn't one. I would say James A. Banks, but nobody else. I think very few other people would. But two other names I do mention in my book are Andrew Koppelman. He's a law professor at Northwestern, and I forget when it was published, in the 90s, I guess. He wrote a really good book on social justice and the civil rights revolution. As a political theorist and a lawyer, it was like this vision coming out of his brain. That was really good. I've always found that to be an amazingly prescient and far-sighted vision of civil rights politics, generally speaking. And then Catherine McKinnon would be the other person. She's a lawyer, and she's very ambitious in, she succeeded in making harassment a category of anti-discrimination law. And she has a very ambitious sense of her own opinions about this stuff. And she wrote books that were literally meant to be a kind of, feminist theory of the state or whatever. And so it is a little bit narrowed by her focus on gender only. But I think I'd say, if I had another couple lifetimes, I would devote a few years to each of those, to writing about each of those, because it is something we need. We actually need some starting point for understanding the civil rights revolution and what it was. But listen, I do want, very briefly, if you don't mind, just summarizing why the Trump legal changes are likely to take hold. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Or is
Yeah.
that going to knock you off your agenda?
Yeah, we can end on that note.
Okay, so just very briefly, if you look at the affirmative action side, I broke it down into 6 bundles of policies, and 3 of them have to do with employment. One is the Federal Civil Service is an affirmative action employer. Then you have the contracting power of the federal government being used is a second. And then the third is a rule that allows private sector anti-discrimination, private sector affirmative action, Supreme Court decision. So those are 3. A fourth is in voting, and a fifth is affirmative action in higher education. In voting, there's kind of affirmative action policy in effect, what are called the creation of max Black and max Hispanic districts. That's permitted right now and goes on in some states. So three in employment, voting, higher education, affirmative action, and then finally what's called disparate impact law under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The federal funding cutoff threat is in Title VI. That's what's crucial about it. And the federal government has been using that cutoff threat to go look for inequalities, group inequalities between blacks and whites, and sometimes gender, to identify these inequalities. And then they bring lawsuits. The federal government can bring lawsuits against private sector entities or governmental bodies, state and local government, whatever, that they find guilty of the somehow having a policy that leads to inequalities. Now, that does not have to be overt, deliberate, intentional discrimination. It can just be a policy like if you have height and weight standards or whatever, right? You're going to have more tall people and therefore more men in your fire department. Something like that would be an instance of disparate impact. And so that's this sixth area, and that's a somewhat complicated area. But anyway, of those six areas, the Trump administration's anti-DEI efforts take aim at five of them. They don't, so far as I know, they don't go after voting yet. But every one of the others, somehow or another, they have had an effect. And the one that we will be hearing more about is in higher education. That is only getting started yet. I think we're still waiting to hear more things from the Department of Education. I have an article out today in Law and Liberty, actually, about a Dear Colleague letter that came out from the Department of Education. So that is starting to happen. And so on the cultural side, getting rid of all the DEI offices and officers, that's a more complicated legal story. And so I'll just have to really, really truncate it to say harassment was an invention of the 1980s, and that includes things like offensive statements. And so that's a massive expansion of what discrimination is. And then how it gets enforced is also another set of expansions, because employers are no longer responsible for like their own policies of hiring and firing. Now they're responsible for what their workers do. They become like a nursemaid of all the or supervisor of all their employees' opinions and what they say to one another and their social interactions. And that was not foreseen in the law, certainly. But that happens as soon as harassment, hostile work environment harassment becomes something that the law is now saying is discrimination. You as a corporation can be sued for that. You're liable for this. Now you have to worry about it. And then the final step is the Supreme Court tells them, well, you can protect yourself if you take preventive and corrective measures. And that then creates the need for preventive and corrective measures. And preventive measures include things like diversity training, and corrective measures include things like firing people. And so now you have the creation in the 1980s and 1990s. By 1998, this was a completed package for all the censorship and it's privatized enforcement. So the HR folks are kind of watching everybody. Then there has to be diversity training, and we have to check out the climate of the workplace and send out opinion polls to everybody and monitor what's going on and field complaints, harassment complaints, and so on. And so we're constantly worried about this because we can get sued, and our reputation will suffer if we get sued also, lose millions of dollars in lawsuits. And so all of that happened at the same time. And the Trump efforts go after that stuff by simply getting rid of the offices and officers that deal with it. They don't bother getting into the nuts and bolts of the law, which I think is genius in a way. And what's left it will be interesting to see how harassment lawsuits proceed now, because it was called a safe harbor under the law, that if you had preventive and corrective measures, when you get sued, if you come into court and say, look, we have diversity training, we fire people who do this kind of stuff. This case we should not be held liable for it because we take all these preventive and corrective measures, which you, the court, told us to do. And sometimes that does work. And if you haven't done it, it can really count against you. So it'll be interesting to see what happens now if people are going to be able to bring lawsuits where they say, I work for the federal government, I was harassed, and you know what? The Trump administration got rid of preventive and corrective measures, and so they're to blame. I get $20 million or whatever. I mean, it will be interesting to see how that happens, and that is room for further reform too. It does seem to me that the Trump administration needs to start rethinking how we enforce Title VII and especially harassment. Should we be asking them to do diversity training and firing people because now they're the privatized enforcers of the civil rights regime, and they wield pretty harsh penalties, without any due process. There's no trial. You just get fired. If you say something a little, weird, it's up to the manager. Do we want to have a lawsuit, or do we just fire this person? And often the person gets fired. So all of that is the legal architecture. And then Trump kind of went after both sides of it pretty effectively, it seems to me, in the moves that were made so far. And so it's likely to have a long-term effect. And as I said it earlier, it's going to be very hard for Democrats to come back and to put all that back in place, because when they do, they'll have to own it. And it does seem to me that there are a lot of Democrats right now, the leaders of the Democratic Party, people like Carville, James Carville, they're saying, man, this is a mistake. We need to get out of this. We need to be out of the business of wokeness and so on. So likely to be in a long-term change that we're seeing beginning here.
Okay. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Thomas Powers, for joining the show once again.
Thank you once again for having me. Appreciate it.